And Senator Albert Gore Jr. holds a news conference in Washington, D.C. to talk about his support in the South. Our first stop this week is Hopkins Center on the campus of Dartmouth College, Hanover, New Hampshire. Earlier this week, Republican presidential candidate Pat Robertson visited the campus to deliver a speech and take questions from the students.
Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Very happy to be here. My brother is a Dartmouth graduate. I'm a Yale graduate, if you'll forgive me for that sojourn in New Haven, but it's good to be here with you. I read this article a couple of weeks ago, just a few paragraphs that I thought you might find very interesting. It starts, "I venture to submit to you that during the past 40 to 50 years, those who are responsible for education have progressively removed from the curriculum of studies the Western culture which produced the modern democratic state. That the schools and colleges have, therefore, been sending out into the world men who no longer understand the creative principle of the society in which they must live. That deprived of their cultural tradition, the newly educated Western men no longer possess in the form and substance of their own minds and spirits the ideas, the premises, the rationale, the logic, the methods, the values, or the deposited wisdom which are the genius of the development of Western civilization. That the prevailing education is destined, if it continues, to destroy Western civilization and is in fact destroying it. That our civilization cannot effectively be maintained where it still flourishes or be restored where it has been crushed without the revival of the central, continuous, and personal culture of the Western world. And that therefore, what is now required in the modern educational system is not the expansion of its facilities or the specific reform of its curriculum and administration, but a thorough reconsideration of its underlying assumptions and its purposes. And you would say, who wrote that and when was it delivered? Well, it was written by columnist Walter Lippmann. It was delivered in a Phi Beta Kappa address in the year 1940, which was 10 years before I began my college experience. And I'm here to tell you that, of course, things are much worse than they were when Walter Lippmann wrote about my generation getting ready to go to college. Have we indeed lost the foundation of our Western culture? Have we, as Professor Bloom suggests, closed our mind? Is there indeed a crisis in education? Do we have serious problems? The President's Commission on Excellence in Education, a paper entitled "A Nation at Risk," said this rather alarming word: if an enemy had done it to us, we would have considered it an act of war. How bad is education? How good is education? What should be the role of the government in education? And I'm responding to this particular paper, the federal government in education in the next decade. What should be done for the colleges? What should be done for the universities? What should be done for the secondary schools, the elementary schools? What should we do in our society? Now, every one of these papers I've read, almost without exception, I've read a number of them, focus in on spending. The question is, how much does the government spend, and how much should it cut, or how much should it increase spending? And if a person wants to spend more, he's for education. If he wants to spend less, he's opposed to education. Well, obviously that's nonsense, because between the year 1962 and the year 1980, the spending on education in America, not collegiate, but the elementary and secondary education, increased 630%. At the same time, every single one of those 18 years, the scholastic aptitude test scores of students graduating from high school declined, without exception. And consequently, we cannot equate spending with quality. Because if we did, we would say America now has the best education in the world, because we spend currently $270 billion on education. So the issue is not do we spend more or less. New Hampshire has the highest SAT scores of any high school graduates in any state in America. They are number one. And yet New Hampshire spends probably less than any other state per capita on its educational system at the state level. That doesn't say that education isn't at the local level, but in terms of the state level, there is less, or it's, I don't know the exact number, it's either at the bottom or second or third in terms of per capita pupil expenditures. So it's not money that does it. It's never been money. You can't buy good education. It's impossible to buy a good mind. It's impossible to buy the creativity that is necessary, the cultural impetus, the artistic expression, the philosophical thoughts. These things don't come from pay. You can't buy them, and more money doesn't give them. So normally speaking, our policymakers start with the wrong assumptions. And most politicians think in terms of spending. Spend more, spend less, but what about quality? Well, let's take a look at the problem. I have had some experience, as was pointed out. I'm the only candidate for president who ever founded a fully accredited graduate university. We have 5 graduate schools, MBA program, and a master's degree in education. We also have a law school. It's a very expensive undertaking. I wouldn't advise it to anybody going out into the world. Whatever you do, don't start a college or a university. But I did it. I've also gone out into the inner cities of America, to Watts, Bedford-Stuyvesant, the south side of Chicago, the inner city of Atlanta, Houston, Birmingham, Philadelphia, and in the process have trained through our organization about 123,000 people how to read and write without taking one nickel of federal money. Again, it is necessary to take money, and we have developed at our university a program that can guarantee literacy in 36 lessons to any child with an IQ of, let's say, 80 or 90, whether that child is Hispanic, Cambodian, American Indian, inner city black, a person deprived in Appalachia, or whatever cultural environment the individual comes from. 36 lessons. Using volunteers, it costs about $8 per pupil to guarantee a foundation of a 22,000 word vocabulary. And it's nothing more thrilling in the world than to see a little child, and I've seen them in a place like Chicago, 3 or 4 years old, a little black child, reading with fluency. Or to see an American Indian child who had just learned to read and who ran all over the house all night long because he could suddenly read. And it was the most wonderful thing to see what happens when light, in a sense, can illuminate somebody and learning comes in through a very simple program, a broad-based phonics program of reading. And it's been so dramatic that in one instance in Pittsburgh, we took a girl who was reading at the 2nd grade level, and in 20 days had her reading at the 7th grade level. We jumped 5 grade levels in 20 days by the appropriate techniques of reading skills. So, again, it's not money, but it is the quality of the education we deliver and the people who are delivering it. What about functional literacy? What did I find in the inner cities? I found that half of the kids there can't read and write. In New York City, 73% of the public school students read at or below the 3rd grade level. And this means that after the 3rd grade, everything they read is incomprehensible to them, which of course explains the fact that they have at least a 45% dropout rate. People don't finish high school. And this is not New York. I was told by the assistant city manager of Philadelphia that one of their suburban neighboring communities graduated a high school class this past year with 85% of the students functionally illiterate. Now, this is an appalling thing considering we're spending all this money. We have serious problems. Some of our students were put in a math competition with students from other nations. We scored just above Swaziland in math skills. In reading skills, we placed about 11th in the developed nations of the world. And when you begin to look at college students, and When I was on television and doing television news, we sent a camera crew up to the University of Maryland. Now, I'm not pointing the finger at any particular school. It just happens it was close to Washington. That's where we had a news office, so we sent the camera crews over to the adjoining campus. And we interviewed some people who were either sophomores or freshmen at Maryland to see how skillful they were in subjects. We asked them such difficult questions as, could you tell us what presidents were in office in the United States between John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan? Answer from a young lady who was either a freshman or sophomore, let's see, there was Truman and there was Hayes. No, he's old, isn't he? We said, can you tell us what nations America fought in World War II? I remember the young man who answered that question. He said, yes, we fought Pearl Harbor, we fought Korea, and we fought the Spanish. Of course, that wouldn't happen at Dartmouth, would it? But it did at the University of Maryland. We said, can you give us the square root of 144? That even I can do that, and I have very limited math skills. Young man thought for a while. He said, it's 17. We tried another one. We said, can you tell us how you find the square or the area of a rectangle? And the man thought a little bit. He said, yeah, it's twice the base times the height. We said, can you tell us who was president of the United States during the war between the states? And the guy said, oh, come on, man, let's I mean, that's not real. And so we went. In fact, they didn't know anything, but they had been admitted as students in good standing in a state university. You see, there are two kinds of illiteracy. Number one, there is functional illiteracy. That means you cannot function. You cannot read a newspaper. The average high school student today, graduating from a normal high school in America, cannot function in a supermarket. I often can't function there either because the prices boggle my mind. But these people can't compute the cost per ounce of a particular product. They can't figure up a column of figures to see what kind of purchases they're making. They are functionally illiterate. We have 29 million of those people in America. We grew 2.3 million of them last year in America. Either they came to the country from other nations or else they were brought up in our school system. Now, the second kind of illiteracy that we're facing is not functional illiteracy, it is cultural illiteracy. And the cultural illiteracy means they don't know anything about the culture of the society in which they live. Now, the principal task of education is to transmit the cultural values of one generation to another, and then to prepare students to ask the probing questions that are needed to question the assumptions, if you will, of that culture, to take from them those things which would be enduring and possibly to supplant others that wouldn't be. That is a normal course of education, to be probing, to be intellectually alert. When I went to law school, they had what we call the hidden ball game. They called it the Socratic method. I didn't know even what they were talking about for the first couple of months. We didn't really understand because it was always, what do you think? What do you think? What is this? What is that? But it sharpens your mind wonderfully, especially when you're, as a lawyer, dealing with cases that are against you. When the case is against you, you argue the facts. When the law is against you, when the law is against you, you argue the facts. When the facts are against you, you argue the law. But whatever it is, you can always say, well, the judge was bribed, and therefore this case doesn't apply. Or there was a red-headed plaintiff, I'm representing a brunette. It's a totally different case. And so they taught us those things in law school, but it made us think. And that is a very important part of at least a college or postgraduate education, is to be able to think, to reason, to understand. But we must be able to think based on an assimilation of the cultural values of our society. We can't start out with nothing and then make assumptions. We have to have some basis on which to compare, some knowledge, some point, if you will, of departure. And in our schools today, not only are the students functionally illiterate, they're culturally illiterate. For example, As someone said, a president has to know certain key facts in order to run for the presidency. He has to know, for example, where South America is. I mean, it's very important. You know those things. And 25% of a group of students that were being tested could not locate the United States of America on a map, much less South America. And at the University of Maryland, again, we wanted to test the students in their knowledge of geography. So we said to them, what three states, just what states border on California? And one of them said, I used to live out that way. She said, I believe it's Washington and New Mexico. We had some other problems like that, but how can we have a culture when the people do not know or ask such questions as this? And this was asked not by Maryland, but I believe UCLA, maybe some of the Valley girls out in California. They said, we can't understand why Roosevelt and Churchill were so mean to that nice Adolf Hitler. You see, they didn't know anything about the Holocaust. They didn't know anything about the Second World War. They had not been taught even the facts of recent history, much less the struggle that the world went through to gain freedom against oppression. They don't understand the genius, for example, of Colonel John Stark, who made the statement, live free or die, that is emblazoned on the license plates here in New Hampshire. They don't understand what freedom is. Why should you struggle for freedom? What does it mean? What does it mean to be free? What does it mean to be responsible? What does it mean to have a representative democracy or republic? What does it mean to preserve liberty? What do these things mean? Well, they're not being taught them in the schools. There is not a transmission of the values. Now, why? What's wrong? First of all, I served on the President's Commission on Victims of Crime, and we travel all around the country and listen to testimony, and some of it would curl your hair, of the things that go on. But it seems like about the most dangerous place in our society is a public school in a major inner city. There are 250,000 acts of violence, crimes, per month in the school system of America. Now, when I was a kid growing up in school, you'd throw spitballs, or you'd spray water in the water cooler, you'd cut into line, or, you'd trip somebody in the hall, and you'd go get sent to the principal's office, and I had to subtract 3 from 1,000 over, and it drives you crazy. But that was my punishment, see? Not anymore. It's assault with a deadly weapon. It's possession with intent to distribute narcotics. It is aggravated assault. It is rape. It is robbery. It is every kind of felony known to man. And did you read the story the other day about the kid in Detroit who was chasing his friend down the corridor? Not a friend, a schoolmate down the corridor with a loaded revolver. He caught him at the end of the run, and as they say, iced him off. It was terrible. Murdered him right there in the school corridor. 250,000 acts. It's very hard to learn when your life is in danger. And teachers in some of those schools are showing all of the symptoms of battle fatigue, the same symptoms that a soldier would show in combat, because it is a combat zone. They didn't used to rape teachers in our schools in Lexington, Virginia. They rape teachers in many of the inner city schools now. They're acts of violence against teachers. So, number one, we have experimentation. Maybe half of the kids in high school have tried marijuana at least once, and a number of them are regular users. We have a great deal of alcoholism in the schools, and we also have crime and lack of discipline. So the environment is not conducive to study. But the second thing that is perhaps more pervasive is the technique of instruction that has been adopted in the school system. We have gone away from the concept of teaching facts in our schools. It is seemingly inappropriate to burden young people with the facts of history and geography and science and math, that sort of thing. So we have what is called a life-centered curriculum based on adjustment to certain values. And a member of Parliament from England told me this rather interesting story. They have moved that to its ultimate in England. And in one class, one of the leaders in the educational movement came to school to test the students. And he said to them, "What is 9 times 9? And a bright young man in the front row held up his hand. He said, "You?" He said, "It's 81. And he says, no, that's not what we're looking for. He said, "We want you to reason and adapt this to life." And so he called on somebody who was a failing student in the back. He said, "How much is 9 times 9? He said, "It's about 75. He said, "That's what we're looking for." Well, that's not what anybody else is looking for. When we're dealing with precision electronics and computer sciences and all the tremendous technology of our scientific age, we can't have people thinking 9 times 9 is about 75. It just doesn't work. But it's that kind of teaching or lack of teaching that is causing this confusion. The second thing that, in my estimation, is extremely damaging in our schools is that we no longer are transmitting moral values. A teacher from Mobile, Alabama, told me of a teacher's manual that he had to instruct his pupils, high school students, in a discussion group about values. And the question was, is shoplifting right or wrong? So they discussed it, I mean, it's a big issue. Are you supposed to steal from the local haberdashery store or not? But I like that blazer. Why can't I have it? Well, they talk about those things. At the end of the discussion, the pupils then ask the teacher, "Well, teacher, tell us, is it right or wrong?" Answer, "I cannot tell you whether it is right or wrong. You have to make your own value judgment." Well, that may sound a very culturally avant-garde, but the truth is, if one of those kids goes over and steals something from the local department store, he's going to jail. It is wrong to steal. It is wrong to shoplift. It is against the law, and the teacher should have said that. Under our current laws, it is wrong to steal. But they are no longer allowed to give value judgments. All they can give is a value clarification to let youth decide. And so we are developing in our high schools a condition that is known as existential despair. The Germans called it Angst. My son, who went to Yale, said the Yale Daily News had a flock of geese flying along crying out Angst, if you can imagine, only at Yale. But anyhow, existential despair. But you say, well, that's a joke, and it sort of is funny, except suicide has become the second or third most prevalent cause of death among teenagers because they can't handle it. There is no framework to put the facts in. What is it all about? There are 3 questions that everybody should ask. If you haven't asked them, you need to. Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? They're the 3 fundamental questions of life. Education should at least lead people in some direction or give them the framework out of which they can work out some solutions. But if there are no answers to the ultimate questions, then where do the facts of history fit? Where do the facts of science fit? Where does all of this other stuff fit? And in a sense, why bother? Why don't we just end it all now? That is what is happening. And it's a very tragic thing, but at the same time, we don't have the framework for knowledge or culture. Now, the next thing that they're doing, and I think this is very tragic, they have adopted in many reading programs something called the look-say method of reading, instead of the time-honored phonics method of reading. With phonics, you learn how to say the vowels, and you learn the sounds of the consonants, and you learn the matching of consonants and sounds, and you get so that you can put together almost any combination, and therefore you lay the foundation of a very elaborate vocabulary. With the look-say method, every word is memorized. And the child who has taken that will graduate from high school with a vocabulary of about 1,500 words, and that's the max, because every word is learned. And if they're unable to put those combinations together, they have flashcards, and they say, "This is a picture of a monkey." So the child sees and says, "Okay, monkey." And the teacher says, "You see, that has a long tail." And so the child says, "I see that." And then they bring out the word monkey, M-O-N-K-E-Y, and they say, "You see that last letter? It's got a long tail." So you memorize that word and you put them together with the pictures. You see the monkey and you think of that word, look, say. So the child says, "Okay, I've got it." And then a few days later, they bring out the picture of a turkey. And then they get confused. And they talk about that they're learning impaired because they can't cope, because it doesn't make any sense logically, and they can't accommodate the various disciplines to have to memorize every word. Whereas if they did a broad-based phonics method, they would have a key and a foundation to put together any word, even if they didn't understand the word. This is one of the critical problems about functional illiteracy. They can't read and write, and why we have such broad-scale illiteracy in our public school system. Now, what are some of the quick solutions? We've got to go back to broad-based phonics. I don't think there's any question about it. Number two, we've got to go back to basics in our educational system. It is absolutely necessary that we teach the facts of history, the facts of math, the facts of geography, the facts of science. People have to have a foundation to build on for subsequent learning experiences. Number three, we have to transmit the values of our society. We have to teach the great struggles of our society. Why is there freedom? Why did we fight a revolutionary war? What is the meaning of the Declaration of Independence? What does representative government mean? What are the cultural aspects of our society? Where did we take our foundations from? And in that, not only do we include the Locke and the Hobbes and all the various political philosophers who have shaped our experience in government, but we certainly need also to get to the spiritual roots, the biblical roots, the Judeo-Christian heritage that has been such a rich part of our heritage. But most of that has been cut out now in our school. The next thing that is absolutely imperative is to do what New Hampshire does. I was talking to a former governor just an hour or so ago, and he says the reason New Hampshire does so well is because it has local control of education. That is absolutely key. It has to be not in the federal government, not in the state government, not in the hands of a powerful teachers union, but it needs to be at the local level with parental concern for education. And I would also like to suggest and see in the educational system some enrichment. In Bloom's book about the closing of the American mind, I think he got perhaps a little too rhapsodic about the classics. But we do need to teach the classical great books of our culture. Somebody today, I was very impressed. I was at the bookstore and somebody brought over a copy of Plato's Republic, said, "Would you sign it?" Well, of course, I didn't write it. I have written several books, but I was deeply honored that I was asked to put my name on so eloquent a document. But we need to study the classical material. I went to prep school and I studied these things, but we don't do that in college, in high school. The other thing that we need, in my estimation, which would enrich our language potential tremendously, would be to reintroduce not only the study of foreign languages in our schools, but to introduce the study of Latin. I took 2 years of Latin. It gave me a tremendous background for the understanding of various Romance languages and English. And when you study a little Greek, as I have, and a little Latin and so forth, it gives you an enormous vocabulary potential that you wouldn't have otherwise, and enables you to think in concepts that are not available to somebody with a more limited vocabulary. It would be a tremendous tool in enriching our study potential. Furthermore, we've got to get into more advanced computer science and other things like that in the lower years of school, but these are very important. Now, very quickly, what should the federal government do? This paper that I'm supposed to be responding to wasn't talking so much about quality, but just spending money. How should we spend it? He recommended we go to zero-based budgeting, which would take the $19 billion that's being spent each year in federal education and go back to zero and start all over again. It was the conclusion of the writer of this paper, as I understood it, that the federal programs really aren't very successful at any level. And I think partially the reason is that if you put money into a bad system, of course you're not going to get a very good product out of it under any circumstances. But number one, I would propose educational vouchers. I'm a very great believer in free enterprise. I don't like monopoly. I don't like for one group to hold control of anything. And I think the more freedom we can give in the hands of parents and teachers, the better we'd be. Not parents, teachers, and students. And if there was a quality school, be it a parochial school, or be it a magnet school, or be it a particular vocational school, or whatever kind of school it was, if a parent thought this was the place to get the best education for a child, then that individual would have a voucher. Now, the vouchers from the federal government would only go to the poor because that's the only subsidy that's currently being given. But it seems like to me that that would be an enabling type of situation where somebody in an inner city could say, I can go anywhere with this. I've got the money. I can go and buy the best. Now, obviously, vouchers could not be used to discriminate against the poor, against any race, nor could it be used to introduce an intrusion of government into religious affairs. Neither of those things. But vouchers have an enormous potential, if applied on the state level, to bring a new renaissance in education, because vouchers would be spent where the best education was, where there was a crime-free, disciplined, drug-free school environment, and where students learned something. So that's number one. Number two, I favor some pilot projects. I don't think the government has any business interfering in local education. I don't think they should be writing the textbooks and setting up national teacher testing and that kind of thing. I think the best education is at the local level, and it should be left in the hands of the local communities and the states, not the federal government. But the federal government is a bully pulpit, and it's a place for demonstration. And I would like to see demonstration projects. I know this may sound a little grandiose, but I would like to pick a state that's educational system is acknowledged to be the worst in the nation or at near the bottom. Whatever state comes to mind would be fine with me that you would think in your mind. But I would like to see $50 million or $100 million spent in cooperation with that state to bring a level of education to demonstrate that using certain techniques of education, especially the phonics method of reading and other types of enrichment programs, that in a dramatic length of time, say 3 or 4 years, that state could come from 49 or 50 up to the top 10 in educational excellence. And that would then be a laboratory pilot project that other states could learn from and come off with various concepts of teaching and teaching skills. That would be something that I think would work very well. The next thing that I would like to see the federal government address is the overall problem of illiteracy. I believe that spending $2 or $3 billion, and that isn't much in relation to $19 billion, but if we spent it in the appropriate programs, and I know that the program that we have developed at our university would work, we could essentially eliminate the major problem of functional illiteracy in the country among adults as well as children. And I think this would, I understand the cost in our nation is $220 billion. So to bring these people into the productive sector, to take them off of welfare, you'd be interested to know 60% of the people in prison are functional illiterates. You know, they get out of jail, there's nothing for them to do except sell drugs, steal, or possibly get into prostitution. There are not many trades open to somebody who can't read and write. And so if they're released from prison, they'll go right back into prison because there's no opportunity for them. This would alleviate our prison crowding and would give hope and dignity to a great number of people. I can't see, of all the things that we could do in the federal government, why we couldn't make a war on illiteracy and eradicate it with tried, true, proven methods. And I think we could do it in a 5-year period of time. It would be one of the most challenging projects that this nation could engage itself in to come up to the level we used to know in terms of literacy. The next thing that this paper addressed had to do with the guaranteed student loan program and other federal funding for college students. I favor myself some kind of work program. I would rather not see young men and women come out of college burdened by debt, whether that debt was $20,000 or $30 or $40 or $50 or whatever the amount is. It's getting higher and higher as the tuition costs are going up. I would like to have, certainly for the poor students, not a grant program, but a work program, worked out, if you will, with the colleges, with the universities, with the institutions of higher education, that would determine where work is needed on the campus or in relation to the life of the academic community, and let these students be paid while they attend school. It might take an extra year, but that's not going to hurt them, so they go 5 years instead of 4. When they leave, they won't owe anybody anything. And they'll have their education. In terms of loans, and I approve this particular recommendation of this gentleman, there was a suggestion that there have been many defaulted loans. Matter of fact, some of the loan programs were an absolute joke. They were more of a giveaway program than anything else. That loan program would be better, in my estimation, and I agree with the author, in a private bank, or at least a federally chartered bank, a federally funded bank that would put the appropriate standards on the loans and on the loan repayment terms so that students would have money available, but the money would also be collected, put into a revolving fund, so it would be available to other students later on down the road. It wouldn't be just a one-way where there are many, many people out in the society who haven't paid off their loans, or where it was just a burden on the taxpayer. I think it could be a business. It could be the kind of business that could be at least self-sustaining, and it could be an ongoing program available to the students who want such assistance in undergraduate and especially graduate programs. Obviously, the government, the federal level, needs to determine where our national interests lie and whether we need more scientists, whether we need people who are expert in the Russian language, whether we need people who are experts in some chemistry, biology, or some computer science, or in applied physics, or whatever it is we want. And such students could be paid, if you will, scholarships and encouraged to go, just outright scholarships, not loans, but grants from the government to pursue studies in the skills that the society needs. And that would be one more way of allocating these funds to get the maximum national benefit out of them. And beyond all this, the government could encourage, by withholding certain grants, excellence at the state level. And if states refused to accommodate their educational systems to proven norms of excellence, or if they were discriminating against any particular group, or if they truly were rewriting history or failing to deliver the kind of quality that was needed in education, then there would be a little bit of a stick involved as well to say, well, all right, funding such as it is from the federal government could be withheld unless you bring your standards into line with the accepted norms. Not the content particularly, but are you indeed turning out quality students? And are you doing excellent work in relation to the scholastic aptitude tests or any other tests that are normative? But beyond that, I think that we have an opportunity in our educational system that's unparalleled. We have a crisis if we don't handle it. I remember, and with this I close, in 1968 I went to the nation of Colombia and started a corporation. It was called Nuevo Continente Sociedad Anónima. And with that corporation we purchased a radio station and did business. And one of the things that I wanted to determine in Colombia was how much money an average worker got paid for a day's work. Because if you find that number, then you can pretty well put everything else into perspective in terms of prices. I was told that an average worker got roughly $1 American a day. I believe the exchange rate then was about 12 pesos to the dollar. Then I said to them, what is your level of literacy? And they said, we have 50% literacy, 50% of our people are illiterate. You see, that meant half of the population could not earn more than a subsistence wage because they couldn't do anything. U.S. News and World Report projected that in America, if we continue the trend that is now underway, by the year 2050, that isn't very far away, we will only have a 35% literacy rate. We will have a lower literacy rate than a banana republic. And that means we will become not a second-class power, but a third or fourth-rate power. This is a very serious matter we're addressing, and it's one that we cannot play politics with, and we cannot be trading off big blocks of votes with some union or some special interest group. It's something that concerns every single American, because the ultimate cause of freedom and the ultimate survival of America as a nation as we know it, that is free and strong and economically self-sufficient, depends not only on the transmission of our cultural heritage, but the transmission of our literacy skills and the other academic skills that we have taken for granted for so many years. It's not spending, it is quality. And to see that every single child in America who is capable of doing so mentally learns how to read and write, and that we eliminate functional illiteracy from America, and that we begin to have a school system that transmits the magnificent values of freedom, liberty, and justice that we've known in this nation. Thank you very much. We have time for some questions. Yes, sir. Yes.
Science education, and a couple of times you alluded to the importance of teaching facts.
Yes.
What is the use, in your opinion, of the appropriateness of teaching biblical new creation in classes for specific purposes to teach science?
Did everybody hear the question, or should I repeat it? All right, the question is that I alluded on a number of occasions to the importance of teaching science, and then what do you think of teaching a biblical perspective dealing with the creation of the world and mankind as a legitimate part of science? As you probably know, the leading cosmogony now is what's called the Big Bang Theory. But prior to that theory, we had about 9 or 10 cosmogonies as science went through one and then discovered another. And therefore, there was an ever-changing understanding of the nature and origins of our universe. We have just as much right, I think, to allow an hypothesis that there was a creator of life than to allow the hypothesis that somehow this enormously complex world that we have evolved spontaneously from a big blast. It frankly takes a much greater leap of faith to believe some of the tenets of the evolutionary hypothesis going back to that beginning as it does to believe that God created the heavens and earth. And so I think that at least students should be given the opportunity to hear both sides and to make up their own judgment as to the fact that a vast majority of the people in America feel that there was a creator, that God created things. And others can say, well, there's a great deal of scientific evidence or thought to the fact that this was a spontaneous generation. And they should hear the arguments pro and con. But I don't think that science should ever become an orthodoxy, and it has become an orthodoxy. Evolution has become an orthodox subject of faith. It is a type of worship itself to believe in the current hypothesis, because it takes an enormous leap of faith if you ever get into it to read what it says. And I was reading an article in the encyclopedia about the DNA and RNA and the various, building blocks of the human body and where we come from. And this article said that the genetic code for one human being is the equivalent of 1,000 volumes, 500 pages each, with 5-letter typed words on each page. Now, they're asking me to believe that a library of 1,000 volumes of closely reasoned scientific material evolved out of nothing. That's a leap of faith. I would much rather think that there was an author to those volumes and somebody wrote them, because I've never seen spontaneous generation in my library. In the books that I've written, I sat there and wrote them. Anyhow, that's what's being asked. So the question is, yes, let's have both sides. Let's let children and adults and young people learn all the facts, the arguments, pro and con, make their own decisions. There's a hand in the back. Yes.
About the voucher system came about.
Yes.
And students who go to religious school. You stated that you're against intrusion by the government into religion.
Correct.
How can you guarantee that voucher money will not go to subpar schools
if there is some sort of government regulation on these schools.
Well, there are two issues, and you didn't raise the major issue in your question. The Supreme Court has pretty much ruled that a tax deduction is not a subsidy, but that a tax credit is. And that an outright grant might be ruled as some kind of a subsidy by government, therefore either entitling government to interfere or else an unwarranted unconstitutional intrusion. So that is why I just said very quickly we've got to make sure that they don't intrude. The other matter, though, really needs to be regulated in the marketplace. If I'm a parent, I've had 4 children, I know when my children are learning and when they're not. I've moved my one child out of a private school and put her in a public school because the education being delivered in the private school wasn't any good. And I know what my child is doing, and this was my money. I mean, I was paying for it, and then I'd elected to take it from a tax-supported school not because of the money, but because of the quality. I don't think we have to worry about regulating the decisions of consumers. I think they pretty much know when they're getting a good deal when they're not, and that's what I'd like to see as marketplace economy. Yes?
I happen to be from Prince George's County, Maryland,
Mm-hmm.
and I went to public high school there, which is a really good public high school.
Yeah.
In the county. We have forced busing to desegregate the county, and in the late 70s there was extreme white flight out of the county. But also, if you go closer to the city, the more the schools become more black and they become racially segregated. The teachers who teach there are very frustrated with what they've got. They're only making $17,000 as it is. My teachers are doing the same thing countywide. If you say that teacher we're spending too much on the education, what is that teacher going to say? He's already forced to deal with 40 kids in a packed classroom of kids who don't really want to learn and are not motivated to learn. What do you think?
The question has to do with Prince George County, Maryland, that closes in on the District of Columbia, and the closer he said that you got to the district, the more of a segregated environment there was, and overcrowding in the school system, and frustrated teachers who are underpaid. And basically, what do you say to those teachers in that situation when you say you really don't need to spend any more money? You don't need to spend any more federal money. I think that what I said earlier has to do with local control. The local environment, the local city, the local state, the local neighborhood should supply the funds to pay adequate teachers' salaries. I do think that there's satisfactions in teaching that vastly transcends money. I wouldn't recommend anybody going to teaching to make money. I don't think that's a calling where you're going to profit very handsomely, unless you're a law professor who does consulting on the side in Wall Street or something. But and plenty of them do that these days. But the satisfaction of teaching is the joy of seeing a young person's mind open to wonderful ideas, and to think that you're adding to the good of mankind. You're also supported by parents in a neighborhood. Now, you mentioned busing. You see, what busing did was to take students from one part of town and move them to another part of town. And so the teachers did not come in contact with the parents, and the child was not in a neighborhood environment. He was taken back and forth. And so he could be somewhat rebellious, but there wasn't that vital link between the teacher and the child. And I was reading some stats in Dallas. I was down there Sunday, and it indicated that in 1970, before busing, there were 93,000 white people in the schools and about 75,000 blacks and Hispanics in the schools in Dallas. During the intervening period, 1 year later, busing started, and by this current year, there are only 23 or 4,000 whites in the school system, and a few more blacks, but instead of being 55 white, 45 black Hispanic, it had gone to 80% black Hispanic and 20% white. So there was this tremendous white flight from the cities, and then the school district, Dallas Independent School District, had to cope with the fact that they were now dealing with a totally different mix. And those
forced judicial decisions did not accomplish what they had hoped they would accomplish. They did, as a matter of fact, the opposite. And they led to a great deal of confusion. But now we're going back more and more to neighborhood schools. People don't want their kids bused. They want them to stay in the neighborhoods. And I think with that, it'll be better for the teachers. But in certain areas like that, can the government supplement? Well, probably so. I mean, it could possibly be done in areas where there were urgent needs, and especially when the needs had been foisted off on the communities by the federal courts. And we may have to help them get back to a more normal, stable environment and give those teachers some more money to make it worthwhile, and also to relieve the overcrowding in the schools. I don't know that. This is case by case, but it's something I would be willing to consider as president. Yes. The question is that I have mentioned from time to time that the necessity to have certain religious values in teaching, and that I was a little concerned with what are called humanist values. Humanism, according to the definition of the American Humanist Association, is a religion. They filed for tax exemption as a religion. It is a religion which places man at the center of the universe and denies the existence of God. They also deny the existence of any code of conduct in a book called the Bible as having any sacred origins. They're essentially atheists with a different name. These are not humanitarians, which mean people who give money to the poor and so forth, nor are they dealing with the humanities, which have to do with the art and the culture of our civilization. This is a secular humanism, which is a precise term having to do with the elimination of religion from our public life. Many of the textbooks in our society reflect the values of secular humanism. The whole concept of values clarification that I mentioned earlier, in a sense, is an outgrowth of this philosophy. It's an attempt to revalue society without any reference to a creator, strictly in human, secular, materialistic terms. Group called the Assassins in Lebanon, the Assassins. They were an extreme sect that believed in murdering people. That's where we get the term assassin. There have been various other followers of deities that I just don't think would be the best. I wouldn't rather elect to the presidency or any other office, but that's my own personal preference. As president, I can't put a religious test on, and that's the way it is because that's what the Constitution says. Yes.
What actions would you recommend to improve the standards of truth in the government and bring sanctions against those who apply?
I think we need to tell the truth as public officials. I think we have to tell the truth to the American people. Now, there's certain activities that go on in government that cannot be aired in the press. If there are delicate relations going on between our allies or our enemies, if there are covert spy operations going on, we just don't want them aired in the New York Times. But at the same time, I believe in honesty. I believe in truthfulness with the people where those facts are known. Now, we don't want to nitpick our officials to death, and people do forget and they do make mistakes. As I've told people before, I'm running for the job of chief executive officer, not creator, so don't give me but so many standards to live up to. But what sanctions do you have against people that lie? Well, I mean, there's sanctions for perjury under oath, but if somebody just, if you know in child psychology, the best way to get a child to learn how to lie, have any of you ever told a lie to your parents? Did you? I'll tell you how to make a child into a liar. You crowd him every day. What did you do that? What are you doing in your room? Why are you going there? Why do you want to go out? Who are your friends? Tell me about that. And before long, his only defense mechanism is to start lying to you. It absolutely is the way it works. And if you give people some latitude, then they'll tell the truth. But if you crowd people too closely and you put too many rules on them, especially if it's Congress, and Congress is violating the Constitution, which has to do with the separation of powers, And if the chief executive officer, the president, is indeed to be in charge of the foreign policy of America, and if Congress tries to interject itself into foreign policy, which it's been doing, then you're going to set up a condition of conflict where one will try to do its job and the other will try to do its job one way or the other, and they'll begin to clash. And out of that will come some dissembling, because the people say, in order to get my job, I just can't tell them what I have been doing. So if Congress would do what it's supposed to do, the president would do what he's supposed to do, then there shouldn't be any need for deceiving them, the press, or anybody else. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been a wonderful audience. I think my time is up, but thank you very much, and God bless all.